Good afternoon. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. I am delighted to welcome you all to today's program, which features a conversation between Debórah Dwork and Marion Kaplan on Professor Dwork's recently published book, Saints and Liars: The Story of Americans Who Saved Refugees from the Nazis. The book is out now with Norton. The book is a masterful reconstruction of the lives, motives, and importantly, emotions of American Jewish, Quaker, and Unitarian refugee relief workers who put their own existence on the line to save the lives of others during the Second World War. Professor Dwork takes us from Prague to Vilna, Shanghai, Marseille, and Lisbon in the fateful years 1939-1942. Professor Debórah Dwork is the founder and director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the CUNY Graduate Center. She is a leading authority on university education in the field of Holocaust studies, and she is internationally renowned for her scholarship on the social and cultural history of the Holocaust, with particular attention to children, women, and the plight of Jewish refugees. Professor Dwork is the author of many books, too many to mention in this short introduction, but they include Children with a Star, Holocaust, A History, and Flight from the Reich, Jewish Refugees, 1933-1946, both with Robert Jan van Pelt. She is the recipient of the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Holocaust Educational Foundation, the Anne TfL's Kupferschmidt Award bestowed by the Dutch Auschwitz Committee, and the International Network of Genocide Scholars Lifetime Achievement Award. Her most recent book is Saints and Liars, which she will present today. We are so pleased to also have Professor Marion Kaplan, the Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at New York University, as an interlocutor for this conversation. A specialist in German Jewish history and women's history, Professor Kaplan is the author and editor of multiple books and a three-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award for her works, The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, and Gender in Jewish History, co-edited with Deborah Moore. Her most recent book is Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, an emotional history of Jewish refugees biding their time in Portugal as they attempted to escape Nazi Europe. Welcome all. Please, Marion, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I'm honored and delighted to interview Debórah Dwork as a longtime colleague and friend. I also wanted to remind this audience of a few among the many books she has written, and I left the honors to Francesca. Debórah, this is starting with your book now because I will erase the other books as well. In the past, you've written path-breaking books about the Holocaust, from focusing on victims such as children to analyzing Auschwitz, the extermination camp, but also the town, to a book about Jews attempting to escape Nazi Europe with their lives, such as Flight from the Reich, Refugee Jews, 1933-46. And now your latest contributions helps us follow the amazing stories of those intensely committed Americans who found escape routes for fleeing refugees. So here are a few questions that I imagine audience members might appreciate, and then we will turn the Zoom over to the audience as well in the Q&A. First, Debórah, what prompted you to write this book?
So before I go into what prompted me to write this book, let me please take a moment to express my thanks to you, Francesca, for hosting, and to you, Marian, for your friendship over many decades now and your generosity serving as my interlocutor today. I thank the audience members as well, and I urge everyone to please pose questions in the Q&A function, not the chat function. The chat function is disabled. So please pose your questions in the Q&A for when we get to that part of the program. So back to your question, Marian, what prompted me to write this book? And it's a story. Researching my first book on the Holocaust, Children with a Star, I found myself in the archives of Friend's House, the Quaker archival repository. And this is back in the day when documents were in paper. They were not yet digitized. You remember those days, and you remember how we would go box after box, go through box after box. So sifting through those papers, I came to a photograph of a woman, a young American woman, a Quaker, holding a Jewish child in her arms. And I looked at this photograph, dated spring 1942, and location Marseille, France, which was unoccupied at the time. And I said to myself, I said to the woman in the photograph, who are you? And what prompted you to leave the safety of the United States to go to Europe to try to rescue people at risk, Jews and politicals? Who are you? And how did you choose to rescue that particular child? All of those questions were beyond the scope of the book I was writing at the time. So I took those questions, and as young people would say nowadays, I put a pin in them. But at the time, I just put them away. And maybe a quarter of a century later, maybe half a dozen books later, I returned to that question, those questions, with Saints and Liars.
That's a great beginning. So I'm going to follow up on that by getting to the heart of the book. Tell us about a few of the main operatives, their goals, their connections, and their background experiences, if they had any.
The main operatives, well, that entails me explaining a little bit about the structure of the book.
Okay.
Each chapter focuses on one city, 1 year, one operative or an operative couple. And so the narrative arcs from one spot of rescue activity to the next. So Prague, 1939, Vilna, 1940, Shanghai, 1941. For each location and year, an operative loomed large. And they came, well, they were mostly younger, middle-aged people, for the most part. They were dedicated. They were motivated by principle, but also by a taste for adventure. When we read about them nowadays, in general, what we get is the principle. So, for example, Yehuda Bauer talks about one of them, Moses Beckelman, and calls him the saintly Beckelman. Beckelman was many things, but saintly was not among them. He was a kvetch. He was very territorial about his authority. He was ambitious. He did marvelous things, amazing things, but saintly he was not. So your question was, what can I tell you in broad strokes about these rescuers? And I would say that there's no, one size does not fit all. That each one is individual, that they were individual, complicated, complex people. Motivated, as I say, by principle, but motivated too by more personal goals.
That starts us off well. But tell us a little bit about some experience. Were these people with experience in helping others?
In general, They had experience as social workers. Most had experience as social workers. Some did not. Some did not. They were historians, for example, or community workers, but they were not experienced. And so they were completely unschooled in the very things that they needed to excel at. So they were quick learners. They listened carefully to the advice of people who had been there before them to take advantage of their experiences. But basically, these were untrained operatives who did
Great.
amazing things.
Thank you. Now, I think we're beginning to understand why they are saints, but I'm also interested how and why did they become liars?
They became liars doing the work that they did. So, for example, Prague, 1939. I focus on Martha and Wait Still Sharp. They came with 41,000. They were Unitarians. They were chosen by the Unitarian leadership in Boston to go to Prague to aid the refugees pouring in from the perimeter district of Sudetenland into the heartland district of Bohemia and Moravia. So about 250,000 of displaced persons, and the Unitarians created a new department, the Unitarian Service Committee, to address the needs of these people. And they chose a minister, Wait Still Sharp, and his wife, Martha. Wait Still wanted Martha to come with him. He wanted her to serve as his partner in this endeavor, and she wanted it too. But going from Massachusetts to Prague, they left behind their 2-year-old daughter and their 7-year-old son, which was not so unusual for a man, but was very against the grain of gender social norms at the time. So just the fact that Martha went hints at her ambition, her wish for self-actualization. But all of this is very interesting, but doesn't address your question, Marion, about liars. So they took $41,000 of relief funds with them, but that was not sufficient. It was a great deal of money at the time, but it certainly wasn't sufficient to meet the needs that they found. And so Wait Still got involved with illegal currency exchange. This was tremendously dangerous at the time, but he engaged in it, driving the hardest bargains he could, and using the money that was raised to support the relief and rescue activities.
So I want to raise another issue, which has to do with the word smugglers, because that has received a lot of negative attention in the United States of late. And yet they played a very important role. Do you want to tell us about that?
Smugglers were key to helping these people who were wanted, were targeted by the Nazi regime and the Nazi allies. Smugglers were key to helping them cross boundaries and borders. We in the Jewish community are so grateful and appreciative that smugglers did what they did, and in so doing, helped save thousands of targeted people. It seems to me we should erect statues to the unknown smuggler, because those were typically, they were men. Typically, they ran contraband over national borders in peacetime. After, when occupation, with the occupation, they moved to smuggling people, and then after the war was over, went back to smuggling contraband. So they were never publicly acknowledged, of course not, and they faded into obscurity in terms of what we remember or value. But smugglers were the unsung heroes and the unknown heroes of rescue.
Thank you. And I guess we could add foragers too, right?
Oh, foragers were very important.
Okay, go ahead.
I just think that when people think about refugees and about documents, to try to remember that for people on the run, having documents was a near impossibility. With the Gestapo coming to the door, who's going to run to the records office to get a copy of a birth certificate, a death certificate, a wedding, a marriage certificate? So people, the very people who needed the papers had the least opportunity to collect them. So they turned to forgers to create the documents for them, to allow them to move through the streets.
Thank you. I'm wondering, can you explain, since you mentioned the Unitarians and the Quakers, can you explain the differences between one or more Jewish organizations? And that helped as well as the non-Jewish organizations. So Jewish differences and then Jewish, non-Jewish differences.
The Jewish organization that I focus on is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And that was an umbrella organization, or rather, it was one organization that was supported by many different factions in the Jewish community. So they had Orthodox supporters and liberal supporters, all manner of supporters. This created strength because there was a certain unity, but it also introduced all kinds of fissures and cracks, because each of these sectors of the Jewish community had its own specific agenda in terms of rescue and relief. They did not necessarily want, they wanted to rescue everyone. Everyone wanted to rescue everyone, but it was impossible. So each sector of the community had its group that it privileged over others. The same thing was true with the Quakers and the Unitarians. The Unitarians were very clear that while they would have liked to have helped many, they were not a major relief organization. They were a service organization. And their goal was to save people with democratic principles who would help to rebuild democratic states when the Nazi regime fell. So the Unitarians were looking towards the day after, from the moment they got involved. The Quakers, by contrast, held that they wanted to help everyone, and they did not discriminate between old and young, male or female, democratic or autocratic. That is what their principles were. but life is lived on the ground. And in the end, people have to choose. What I found is that those choices were made through emotional responses, irrational. Why did Marjorie McClelland, the young Quaker woman in the photograph, why did she choose that particular child in her arms? Because that child appealed to her.
Thank you. Were there rivalries among
Tremendous rivalries. There were rivalries within each organization, and there were rivalries between organizations. Quarreling went on from morning till night. And in fact, at first, I just didn't pay so much attention to this quarreling. I sort of screened it out to get to the issues involved. And then I realized, no, the quarreling is the issue. We must interrogate, why were these people quarreling so much? And my own feeling is that it was a reflection of the tremendous pressure they were under, the anxiety. They were not, as we discussed, they were not trained operatives. So they didn't know what was going to work or what would prove a failure. And they just operated in this fog of not knowing without clarity. And tempers flared. But then I also think that maybe placid people stayed home. Maybe the people who chose to jump over the Atlantic or over the Pacific, as in the case of Laura Margolis in Shanghai, maybe those people were people who waxed choleric from time to time.
Thank you. And that brings me, I guess, to Laura Margolis and to the Quaker woman. You wrote in the book that women figured prominently in their relief efforts. So can you give us a sense of how gender operated among the saints and the liars?
Gender was a major factor in this story. Service, philanthropy and service had long been women's work. But this philanthropy and this service overseas, independent of social norms, separated from the home office by thousands of miles. This offered avenues for independence that the women had not even dreamed of before, and they loved it. They loved having authority. It wasn't so much about power, it was about authority, that they saw what was the right thing to do and they chose to do it. And maybe this might be a good moment to do a reading.
Yes, definitely.
So I'm going to do a reading now from Saints and Liars, from the book itself. And it's not such a short reading. So for those of you who listen to podcasts, just imagine this as a podcast. The person that I'm going to focus on is Martha Sharp, the wife of Wait Still Sharp, the woman part of the couple sent by the Unitarian leadership in Boston to Prague. Friday, March 24, 1939. Wade still was in Brussels when Tessa Roundtree, an English Quaker in Prague representing the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia. It's one of these organizations that has a very long name. From now on, I'm just going to call it the BCRC. So it was on Friday, March 24th, that Tessa Roundtree tapped Martha to to conduct a group of refugees to England. Their papers were in order. The adults had British visas identifying them as domestic workers, and they had German exit permits. Roundtree would accompany some 50 on a train departing at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Would Martha take the rest on the 4:30 train? Martha was an American and a minister's wife. Those were factors in her favor. She did not have an exit permit, but as she had arrived before March 15, the invasion of the Sudetenland, the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Germany, she could get one locally. She did not need to apply to Berlin. Martha understood that the mission was fraught with danger and risk. I knew that the, quote, domestic workers included some of the most wanted politicals, ardent and well-known anti-Nazis. If the Gestapo should charge us with assisting the enemies of the state to escape, prison would be a light sentence. Torture and death were the usual punishments. But, she calculated, saving endangered people seemed worth the risk. Martha raced against the clock to get the papers she needed. She turned to the U.S. legation, which phoned the Gestapo on her behalf to ask for exit and re-entry visas. The officer agreed to issue them in 10 days. Martha hurried to the Gestapo office to press the process forward in person. It was closed for lunch. The doors opened again at 2, but she had to wait for a superior officer. Martha finally got the documents signed at 3:30. Suitcase in tow, Martha arrived at the station where she found Miss Bull, the BCRC secretary, compiling a list of convoy participants as they appeared. She used a fountain pen filled with green ink borrowed from a man, a physician standing near her. Often, refugees came out of hiding just in time to board a moving train, and indeed, 2 newsmen from the United Press and the Associated Press jumped on at the last minute. Martha's charges occupied 1 train car. Finally nearing the Dutch border, the convoy was ordered to disembark for customs inspection. Martha's effects were given only a cursory glance, but the Germans robbed the refugees of all their valuables, even their wedding rings off their fingers, Martha fumed. Waiting to ensure everyone got back on the train, she heard a cry from the rear of the customs shed. I ran back and opened the door before the guards could stop me. There were the newspaper men, stripped to their waists, bags torn apart. Asking if anyone spoke English and learning that no one did, she picked up a letter with the United States seal, hoping it would serve. This letter puts these men under my protection as American citizens, she asserted. You see the seal of the United States? I will not leave without them. Waving Miss Bull's notes in the air, she declared, they are all on the list. Against all odds, she prevailed. The train soon reached the border, and Martha surrendered Miss Bull's lists to the Dutch officials to check against the refugees' visas and passports. But having jumped on the train at the last minute, the newsmen had not been registered by the BCRC secretary. The Dutch authorities barred their entry. Martha reached for a solution. I ran along the car looking for the doctor with the pen filled with green ink before the train should start. With the pen, I wrote the names of the men on the reverse side of the list And just before the train was to pull out, I found the passport officer. He quizzed her. I am sure those names were not there before, but she insisted, and they were allowed to board. It was, she said, the second near miss. Such a thin line between life and death.
Thank you very much for that very moving excerpt. Let me follow up still on the woman question. Did they get the same salaries as men? Did they work under similar conditions? Could they run the place? You used the word authority. Could they run the place without anyone contradicting them? Maybe start with salaries and conditions.
Salaries. The conditions were the same between men and women because those were really under the control of the operative on the ground. But salaries, absolutely not. So with Martha and Waitstill received his salary. Martha did not receive a penny. So women who came as wives, who came as part of a couple, were expected there to participate in the work that was done. And they wished to do that, but they were not compensated for that work in any way. Laura Margolis was in a different situation. Laura Margolis was a single woman. She was a professional. She was an employee of the JDC, and the JDC asked her to take on the mission of going to Shanghai to help refugees who had ended up in that city move on to other locations. In her case, because she was a woman operative alone, she did get a salary. She did have some authority with the Home Office. Her assessments had some authority with the Home Office, but she was undermined by the very male-dominated Jewish community in Shanghai. So they absolutely sought to cut her off at the knees. And she had no patience for them whatsoever. Eventually, Laura Margolis prevailed, and those men crumbled.
As they probably should have, given that she was helping them so much without their realizing it. I have another question, which is, how did these helpers decide whom to help?
Those decisions rested upon a rational calculus, but in fact were made emotionally. So, for example, Marjorie McClelland, as I mentioned, the American Quaker woman who held this Jewish child, this Jewish little girl in her arms. She was tasked with deciding which of the thousands of children in the Marseille area, she was tasked with deciding which would go on a convoy. She had to choose 50 children to go on a convoy from Marseille to America. And she wrote about her calculus of decision-making, how she thought she would have time to assess and evaluate. She had the idea of a rational calculus, But when I read the very short biographies she wrote about each of the children she chose, one sees that other factors course through the text. They were all, in her view, each child she chose was someone who appealed to her. Physically, she chose children she found attractive. And she said, oh, she's an attractive little girl, such a charming little boy. So she chose children she found physically attractive and ones who were, for the most part, docile. She said he was very manageable. He would be easily trained. So there was a certain kind of child that she privileged. If asked, she would have been horrified. She would have been appalled. And yet, it is so.
Thank you. I would like to ask, I think, one last question, so then we can turn it over to the audience. And that is that you draw our attention to the role of luck and to the unpredictable and the irrational. So please explain that.
So let's take the story of Martha Sharp and the green ink. What I have come to, no, let me interrupt myself to say, listening to survivors' histories for years, recording them years ago, and now listening to those who have died and left a record. Survivors themselves talk about the unpredictable, luck, chance, fortuitous circumstance, timing. And they talk about the irrational. Why? Because I intuitively thought that would be the right thing to do. These sympathies, antipathies, visceral reactions, visceral responses. They talked about this, and I read the testimonies and I listened to the oral histories and I recorded them myself, but I didn't credit it. I didn't credit those factors. I look at age and gender and degree of religious observance and social class and linguistic fluency, but I didn't look at the unpredictable. I didn't pay that same kind of logical attention to the illogical, to the unpredictable, and to the irrational. I did a reading and I talked about Martha Sharp and that pen filled with green ink. Were it not for Nazi policy, practice, and ideology, those people would not have been seeking to get out of Prague at all. But for those two newsmen, the fact that they managed turned on the green ink. The green ink offered that margin of credibility to Martha's assertion that was needed to push it into the safety zone. So this is the role of the unpredictable, the role of who would have, luck, chance. Who would have thought that Miss Bull would have borrowed a pen filled with green ink? And who would have predicted that Martha would have found that doctor and got the pen in time?
That's a wonderful example. And of course, you're right. Luck played such a role. You hear that in most memoirs and most interviews. And I think it's important that you've underlined it. So at this point, I would love to turn it over to audience questions. We have about 15 minutes. And so I'm wondering if if that's okay. And let me look if I can get the Q&A going, then it should be fine. There are a number of questions. The first question is, why did the United States take so few Jewish children?
The United States took so few Jewish children. The United States took so few Jews. The United States took so few refugees, period. It was a time, they didn't take children because they really didn't want refugees. Marion? Did you freeze?
Yeah, do you want to just leave it at that?
Francesca, can you jump in?
Yes, let me jump in. There's several questions
No,
here.
can you hear me? Can you
Now
hear
we
me?
can't, but you're
Yes, now we
frozen.
can.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Francesca.
Let me take a question from Carl Sickerman, who's asking if you can talk more about the personal interviews that you conducted for this project. For example, did you talk with the descendants, the children of some of the women that you are profiling for the book, or any of the people that were saved?
So it's interesting about the children who were, the people who were saved. Many refugees who were saved by the Unitarians, the Quakers, the JDC, they knew that they were helped. Some even, that they couldn't have done it without the help of these organizations. They knew that. They knew further, some knew further which organization it was. Many did not. Many said, I think it was the Quakers, but I really don't know. So there's that. The third line is that they absolutely did not know who helped them, the specific operative who helped them. So recording the oral histories of the refugees who were successfully aided by these operatives offered information about the kind of help that they got, but did not offer information about the people themselves or their motivations. That information came from documents. And as you can imagine, the people who were helping refugees then are deceased now. Not only are they deceased, but even their children are mostly in their 80s now. So my road to them was not through oral testimonies, but was through the paper records they left. And that was a rich experience because many of the operatives, all of the operatives, wrote regularly to the Home Office. They had to. That was part of their job, was to keep in contact with the Home Office and to report to the Home Office. Many also were writing letters to friends and relations. So I was looking for people whose records were there with both the professional correspondence and the personal correspondence, which offered different facets of their experience. And some, like Moses Beckelman, kept a diary. And that fragment of a diary turned up in an exchange of materials with Russia. Just like that, it turned up. And we know that it was Beckelman from the handwriting and from the content. So I don't know if that answers the question that the questioner, because I start giving the answer and it takes me to another place. Marion, is your communication working?
I hope so. How's that?
Yes.
Okay, so then I'll ask the last question, I think, or maybe we have another few minutes. Someone would like to know if you could discuss activities that stem from Orthodox organizations. I guess she means Orthodox Jewish organizations.
Orthodox Jewish organizations in the United States put a great deal of pressure on the JDC main office in New York to save their Orthodox brethren. And they looked specifically at yeshivot. So they were not looking, the Orthodox in the United States were not pressuring the JDC to take unusual measures on behalf of Orthodox families or communities. Their focus was on young men, boys, and older men who were part of scholarly communities, yeshivot. They felt very strongly that these people, the learning that they brought, the erudition that they brought, would be lost to the entire Jewish community if they were not saved. That businessmen, and this is in the record, businessmen could be trained and had simply, easily, while religious learning was prized and privileged by that sector of the community.
A follow-up, which actually asks about the rest of the community, is someone who's asking you whether you've heard of the OSE, and of course you've heard of it. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that saving organization.
So the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, which is the OSE, which is an organization that was that targeted children, to help children. It was founded in Russia and then moved to France. And by the time it becomes part of our story, had headquarters on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. I mentioned Marjorie McClelland and her thought about her rational calculus of decision-making. She was working with OSE operatives on the ground in Marseille to go to visit children's colonies, as they were called. Those were places where children lived. And yeah, they were under the care of OSE. So she went and she visited these OSE Jewish children's colonies. And she had the thought that she would learn about each individual child. But as I mentioned before, she found that her decisions had to be made much more quickly, and that rational calculus of decision-making went out the window in favor of a more emotional choice selection. So OSE was a key Jewish organization operating in France that targeted children as the people they were most interested in saving, in helping and saving.
And
Marion, is it okay if I jump in with a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
I actually have two. There's a few questions in the Q&A from somebody who has relatives that were saved. So what source, connecting to your mention of the fact that you followed the paper trail, survivors, descendants of survivors today, where would they look for information on their rescuers? And then a second question, and maybe we can wrap up with that. What happened to the rescuers after they went back home to the US, especially to the women that had such an important part in those operations? What happened to them when they went back to their American lives?
So for the person who wants to know about the people who helped, the operatives who helped their relations, that's a very difficult lift. The first thing would be, thank goodness now records are digitized. So to look for the name of the relative and to see the route the relative took, and then to go back from there as to who was operating, who was the helper, who was the employee, who was facilitating that particular route at that time. So it would require some real detective work. And I wish this listener all the best in searching for the helper, in the operative in question. And the other question, Francesca, you were asking about was what happened to them when they, so there were many different, I urge you to read the book because I do pay attention to that and follow them through. There was a whole range. So for Martha, for example, she was tapped by the Democratic Party to run for office in 1946. And she did win the Democratic primary, and she loved it. And then she stumped the state to win for the congressional seat, and she lost. But still, she loved all of it. She loved speaking and winning votes and visiting communities. So she ended up being a public figure, Martha. She also ended up divorcing her husband. She had outgrown her role as the minister's wife. One of the things that's so important is that these experiences were transformative. They were transformative in the way that they helped the targets, the people that they helped or saved. But they were also transformative for the operatives themselves, and most particularly for the women, because the women, as we've talked about, had greater authority, greater independence. They had the greater scope for self-actualization than they ever would have experienced had they stayed home. And that those opportunities changed them.
I think we have to come to a close.
There may be time for just one very brief question. Let's see. We did have an earlier question from Larry Goldberg, who wanted to know whether there were any forms of deception from the operatives vis-a-vis their sponsoring office. Whether in order to achieve their results, they had to fudge or deceive, fudge records or deceive the sponsoring organization that had sent them to Europe.
So there wasn't so much fudging or deceiving the Home Office. But if you all recall, I spoke about Wait Still Sharp doing illegal currency exchange. He could not report on his activities, on those activities, those highly illegal and dangerous activities. He could not report on those to the Home Office in Boston. The mail was not sufficiently secure. So he wrote to the accountant of the Unitarians accountant, and he said, from now on, the books will not be, I cannot report to you on my raising of money or use of monies. I cannot keep any records about this. You're just going to have to trust me. And please don't even show this correspondence to anyone, because if there's even the whisper of rumor that I am doing what I am doing, it will end in disaster. I spoke about how the women enjoyed these opportunities for self-actualization. But talking about Waitstill reminds me to say that he enjoyed the danger of illegal currency exchange, as well as other things that they were doing. And as he wrote himself, Yankees like to skate on thin ice.
That's a wonderful way to end up, I think. Thank you so much for the presentation of a really fascinating book. I recommend it to everyone.
And I thank both of you most particularly for this wonderful session. And I thank everyone who's listening.
Thank you so much, Marian. Thank you so much, Debórah. Debórah's book is available from all online bookstores. The link to purchase it from Norton is in the chat. And I encourage you. It's a wonderful read, and it's a terrific story. Thank you all for this conversation. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.